Hey kids, History Channel guy here, and today I'm going to talk about reparations for slavery. But on the way to think, for decades, reparations for slavery has been a hotly debated topic in the United States. However, I'm not here today to tell you whether or not I think we should enact reparations in the United States, but I do want to bring up some interesting discussions we had in my African history class in college. In today's quick history, I discuss the reparations that we never talk about. But before I start, over 98% of you watching my videos are not subscribed to the channel, so I'd appreciate it a lot if you could like and subscribe so I can continue to make free original history content. Also, if you want to see my daily shorts, you can find them on my TikTok channel at History Channel Guy. Okay, self-promotion done. Let's jump into some history about reparations. There's a common misconception that to acquire slaves, European slave traders would personally raid West African villages and capture it through force. Though this did occur in some situations, the bulk of European slave traders just waited on the coast to be given slaves by the other Africans. I know what you're thinking. Oh boy, this is going to be another one of those videos trying to make up for what Europeans did by playing the whataboutism game. And though I'm guilty of doing that, that is not my goal of today's video. Because undoubtedly, Europeans and in the future, Americans deeply benefited from the institution of slavery. However, I do not like it when we bash Europeans for these actions when we never considered the African kings and chiefs and the kingdoms that benefited from the transatlantic slave trade. And in many ways, they still benefit from it today. To start off with, let's go through the brief history of the transatlantic slave trade. Prior to the late 15th century, Europeans were hesitant to take Africans as slaves. This was not because Europeans previously had some high morals which prevented them from having slaves, but it was because Europeans were concerned that if they started to take African slaves, then it would disrupt the Christian culture in Europe. Essentially, they thought that Africans would bring pagan culture to Europe and would convert some peasants to what they believed were queer customs and religions. This will change after the discovery of America, and immediately European powers need to find cheap labor to work on sugar plantations in the Caribbean. Originally, groups such as the Portuguese and Spanish used Native Americans as slaves, but they were unreliable due to their compromised immune systems. It wasn't until 1518 when Spanish King Charles V legalized slavery in Spanish territories on the grounds that slaves would be converted to Christianity. King Charles completely changed the game, and overnight, thousands of slaves started to be transported from West Africa to the Americas. Slaves were needed to populate European sugar plantations, but the one glaring issue was that European life expectancy was less than a year in sub-Saharan Africa. This was mostly due to malaria, but I tell you this information to show that Europeans were not the only ones doing the slave raids, and instead, it was other Africans that mostly did them. According to Professor Toyin Falola of the University of Texas, quote, "The organization of the slave trade was structured to have the Europeans stay along the coastlines, relying on African middlemen and merchants to bring the slaves to them. The Europeans couldn't have gone into the interior to get the slaves themselves." According to historian Akusha Purby of the University of Ghana, slavery has persisted in West Africa since the 1st century AD. However, Purby also believes that it's extremely likely that slavery occurred in West Africa during ancient times. West African slavery was a lot less prevalent than the slavery found in North Africa and the Middle East, and it was not until the 15th century that West African slavery started to take off. The first Europeans to buy slaves in West Africa was a Portuguese explorer named Antoine Gonçalves in 1441. Very soon the Portuguese took over small islands in the region, namely the São Tomé Islands, and by the 16th century, Portuguese colonists started to use the islands to grow sugar. For the next few centuries, the São Tomé Islands became a huge hub for connecting the slave trading to the rest of the world. Simultaneously, the Spanish brought the first enslaved Africans to the New World in 1501, and soon Africans populated the Caribbean islands in what was now called New Spain. Over the next few centuries, West African empires such as the Bono Empire, the Ghana Empire, Mali Empire, Oyo Empire, Kong Empire, Benin Empire, Kingdom of the Koya, Kingdom of the Kasu, and the Ashanti Confederacy rose to power with slavery being their number one industry. So, now lies the question of how and why some Africans were enslaved, and who were they enslaved by? As mentioned earlier, empires such as the Mali Empire embraced slavery and were able to profit from it. The way these empires were able to get slaves was through military conquest. In some situations, such as with the Igbo tribe, the religious officials would even condemn people to slavery for minor crimes and religious infractions. Slavery became so prevalent in some places that the amount of slaves outnumbered the amount of free Africans. For instance, in Ghana and Mali and Shanghai, over one-third of the population was enslaved. In modern-day Sierra Leone, Niger, and Cameroon, half the populations at the time were enslaved, and by the 19th century, the Kingdom of Vai, which is in modern-day Liberia, three-fourths of the population was enslaved. If I were to go over in detail how every tribe benefited from slavery, this video would be a couple hours long, so instead I want to discuss how this relates to modern-day reparations. Many of you might not realize this, but Africa still has dozens of small kings and chiefs. These kings are not the traditional head of state monarchs, but instead they are non-sovereign monarchs. For those of you who do not know this, non-sovereign monarchs are essentially the head of their ethnic group, and they're given limited regional power. Just for show, in Ghana alone, there are 18 active monarchs, most of which have been ruling the territories that they serve for centuries. King Dada Gizabahazen of the Dahomey Kingdom in Benin, for instance, can trace back his family lineage to the 1600s, and his ancestors directly raided interior African villages, enslaved the people, and sold these people to Europeans. King Dada is one of the wealthiest people in Benin, and his family can trace back its wealth to the transatlantic slave trade. Do you see what I mean here? In the United States, there's always the discussion of Americans, most of whom cannot even trace their lineage back to the transatlantic slave trade, paying reparations for slavery, but we never talk about the literal kings and rulers of Africa who have millions of dollars whose families directly contributed to the institution. For reference, in Benin, there are 43 tribal/non-sovereign monarchs. Nigeria has 22, there are 18 in Ghana, 11 in Togo, there are 8 in Burkina Faso and Niger, and in Gambia, the Ivory Coast, Mauritania, and Sierra Leone, there are 2. Guinea-Bissau, Mali, and Senegal all have 1. In almost every scenario, these royal families can trace back their roots to the transatlantic slave trade. In almost every scenario, these rulers today live in luxury because of the misdeeds of their ancestors. What is even crazier is today, many of the families who profited off of the slave trade show very little remorse. In 2019, Nigerian presidential candidate and former governor of the Nigerian state of Calabar, Donald Duke, acknowledged in an interview that his ancestors participated in the slave trade. But according to Duke, he wasn't ashamed of it at all. What is even crazier is in many African schools, the legacy of the slave trade isn't discussed at all. According to Professor Falala of the University of Texas, when growing up in Nigeria, he was taught the history of African culture, about great African kingdoms and great African emperors that ran the subcontinent. However, he was never taught those same African rulers had a large role in the transatlantic slave trade. Another professor, Yunus Rafiq from NYU, says that his family only talks about their role in the slave trade in secrecy. Professor Rafiq's great-great-great-grandfather was a former chief that helped raid interior African villages and sold many of his captives to Arab and European slave traders. What is even crazier, though, is Rafiq's ancestors kept many of their slaves and had them work on coconut plantations nearby, which, believe it or not, is not that crazy of a practice. In many African kingdoms, slaves made up a substantial portion of the population, so it would be really, really easy for them to work plantations. Some of the percentages were so high that it would put even Mississippi and South Carolina in the middle of the Civil War to shame. Simultaneously, if you look at the tribes these African kingdoms raided, they're some of the poorest in the world. For instance, the Batwa people are infamously one of the poorest tribes in Africa, and in my opinion, this poverty can be attributed for how centuries the Batwa people were enslaved by stronger tribes such as the Luba and Bantu peoples. This scenario is not unique to the Batwa people. If you were to look more heavily of enslaved tribes such as the Bakongo or the Mende, you'll immediately notice that these groups still live in immense poverty, while the groups who did the enslaving, for the most part, are wealthy by African standards. Like here in the United States, thousands of African families are embarrassed of their family's legacies, so much so that they've tried to erase former masters from their family trees, and some have even attempted to destroy birth certificates to disassociate themselves from slavers. So, now lies the question of what should be done to acknowledge the legacy of slavery on the African subcontinent. Well, for one, they can start acknowledging it at all. Even if he isn't embarrassed of his family's legacy, Governor Duke is still helping sow the divide by creating museums that commemorate Africa's role in the slave trade. Museums commemorating slavery are extremely rare in Africa, so providing these educational opportunities is an excellent way of sharing many of these tribes' checkered past. Another thing that needs to stop is African schools need to stop omitting their history. As hinted earlier, many Africans never acknowledge their family history, and in school, they're taught that Europeans and Arabs were exclusively responsible for the transatlantic slave trade. African schools need to start teaching that their own ancestors were complacent and in many ways were proactive in the enslavement of former Africans. And lastly, I'm not here to say whether reparations should be done or not in the United States, but I personally think if the United States were ever going to consider reparations, then they need a commitment from the dozens of wealthy tribal leaders and kings in Africa that they would enact similar reparations to their own people. Because if not, we're just virtue signaling and the real perpetrators are not paying for their crimes. Reparations could not be seen as an exclusively American phenomenon. Britain, Spain, France, Portugal, Russia, and basically every other European power that held overseas territory had and sold slaves. This is not even mentioning the Middle Eastern empires such as the Ottoman Empire, which is basically modern day Turkey, that did the same thing. Yet, Africa, as you just learned, cannot be omitted from this list. It is time to teach slavery in its full context and teach about the reparations we never talk about. Thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, remember to like and subscribe for more content. If you'd like to see my shorts, they can be found on my TikTok channel at History Channel Guy. And as always, try to make sure that you watch the full video so I can continue to make cheap history content. Thanks, guys.